The morning of January 12, 1945, at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a group of ordnance officers gathered around what looked like an oversized shotgun shell. The 90mm projectile sat on a wooden examination table, its nose cone removed, to reveal something that made several men laugh out loud. Inside were 20 steel darts, each about the length of a man's hand, arranged in a precise, circular pattern. They looked like finishing nails someone had sharpened to needle points. Colonel James Blackwell from the Ordnance Department picked one up, turning it over in his fingers. He said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had seen too many crackpot inventions. "We are not fighting Indians with arrows." The room erupted in laughter. Someone muttered something about returning to medieval warfare. Another officer suggested they might as well load the guns with knitting needles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The shell they were examining was designated the T15E1, an experimental anti-tank round that represented one of the most unconventional approaches to armor penetration ever seriously considered by the United States military. Instead of a single solid projectile designed to punch through steel plate, the T15E1 relied on multiple sub-projectiles, flechettes in the technical terminology borrowed from the French word for small arrow, that would disperse in flight and strike the target in a devastating spread pattern. The concept violated every principle these men had learned about anti-tank warfare. Since the Spanish Civil War, where German 88mm guns had first demonstrated the effectiveness of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, the doctrine had been clear. You needed mass, you needed velocity, and you needed a hardened penetrator that could concentrate all its kinetic energy on a single point of impact. The physics were straightforward. Armor penetration depended on the sectional density of the projectile, its ability to maintain velocity through air resistance, and the pressure it could exert per square inch of contact with the target. A flechette, by definition, had terrible sectional density. Its long, thin profile created massive drag. Each individual dart weighed only a few ounces. The entire concept seemed to contradict everything the Ballistic Research Laboratory had established about anti-tank munitions. Yet here it sat, funded by the Ordnance Department, assigned a formal designation, and scheduled for comprehensive testing despite the skepticism of nearly every officer who examined it. The T-15E1 had emerged from a series of desperate calculations made in the summer of 1944. American tank destroyers and medium tanks, armed with 75mm and 76mm guns, were encountering German armor they could not reliably defeat. The Tiger the Furs, with its 80mm frontal armor, and the Panther with its sloped 80mm glacis plate, represented a qualitative leap that American gunners found deeply troubling. Standard armor-piercing rounds bounced off or shattered against these targets at combat ranges beyond 500 yards. The 90mm gun, mounted on the new M36 tank destroyer, and some late-production M26 Pershing heavy tanks, offered better performance. Its M82 armor-piercing round could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at reasonable engagement distances. But production of 90mm ammunition was limited, and the doctrine for its employment was still evolving. Some ordnance officers began asking whether there might be alternative approaches to the armor penetration problem, ways to achieve lethal effect without requiring the massive kinetic energy of conventional solid shot. The flechette concept had theoretical roots stretching back to the First World War, when French aviators dropped steel darts called flechettes from their aircraft onto enemy troops below. The principle was simple. A pointed projectile falling from sufficient height could achieve lethal velocity through gravity alone. By 1944, ballistic researchers understood that the same principle might apply to gun-launched projectiles if the engineering challenges could be solved. The primary challenge was dispersion. A single large projectile followed a predictable ballistic trajectory that gunners could calculate with reasonable accuracy. Multiple small projectiles, each subject to minute variations in air resistance and crosswind effects, would spread across an increasingly large area as they traveled downrange. This spreading pattern, which made flechettes useless for precision shooting, might actually be advantageous against certain targets. Consider a German tank company moving in tactical formation. Tanks typically maintained spacing of 50 to 100 yards between vehicles to reduce vulnerability to artillery fire. A conventional armor-piercing round could only engage one tank at a time, but a Flechette round that dispersed its sub-projectiles across a 100-yard diameter circle at combat ranges could theoretically engage multiple targets simultaneously. The concept appealed to a small group of researchers at the Ballistic Research Laboratory who had been studying wound ballistics and the effectiveness of fragmentation munitions. They understood that modern tanks, despite their thick frontal armor, had numerous vulnerable areas: engine deck louvers, turret ring gaps, vision ports, the thin armor on the hull roof and rear deck, all represented potential points of attack if projectiles could strike from the correct angles. Captain Theodor Jensen, an ordnance officer with a background in aeronautical engineering, became the project's most vocal advocate. He had seen combat reports from Normandy describing how German tanks were often disabled by damage to external components rather than by penetration of the main armor. Track damage, gun barrel hits, periscope destruction, radio antenna severing, all of these could reduce a tank's combat effectiveness even if the crew remained unharmed. Jensen calculated that 20 Flechettes, each weighing 3 ounces and travelling at 3,000 feet per second at the muzzle, would retain sufficient energy at 500 yards to penetrate the thin top armor of German tanks if they struck at steep angles. More importantly, the spread pattern would increase the probability of hitting vulnerable spots that a single projectile might miss entirely. He presented his calculations to the Ordnance Technical Committee in August of 1944. The committee was skeptical, but authorized preliminary development under the designation T15. The project would develop a 90mm Flechette round using existing gun tubes and powder charges. If initial tests showed promise, the designation would advance to T15E1 for field trials. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia received the contract for prototype development. Engineers faced immediate technical challenges. The Flechettes needed to be strong enough to survive the enormous acceleration forces of firing, approximately 15,000 times the force of gravity in the first milliseconds after ignition. They needed to separate cleanly from the sabot that held them in the gun barrel, and they needed to maintain stable flight, point forward, throughout their trajectory to the target. The design that emerged used hardened steel darts measuring 7 inches long and 3/8 of an inch in diameter at their widest point. Each dart tapered to a needle-sharp point and featured 3 small fins at the rear to provide aerodynamic stability. The fins were stamped from thin steel sheet and spot-welded to the dart body. 20 darts were arranged in a circular bundle inside a light metal sabot that engaged the gun's rifling. Upon leaving the muzzle, air resistance would strip away the sabot petals, releasing the Flechettes to fly independently toward the target. To understand why the T-15E1 faced such resistance, one must understand the doctrine that dominated American anti-tank thinking in 1944 and 1945. This doctrine had been written in blood across North Africa, Italy, and France, where American tank crews and tank destroyer units had learned hard lessons about armored warfare against a technically sophisticated enemy. The prevailing wisdom held that anti-tank combat was fundamentally a duel between guns and armor, a mathematical competition where kinetic energy and penetrating power determined survival. German tankers had dominated early engagements because their tanks mounted superior guns and heavier armor. The Panzer IV's long-barreled 75mm gun could destroy American M4 Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's gun could not penetrate the Panzer's frontal armor. The Tiger I, mounting an 88mm gun derived from the famous anti-aircraft weapon, could kill Shermans at distances exceeding 1,000 yards while remaining essentially immune to return fire. American responses to this imbalance followed conventional thinking: develop better armor-piercing ammunition, design guns with higher muzzle velocity, build tanks with thicker armor. The 76mm gun became standard on Sherman tanks to improve penetration. The M36 tank destroyer mounted the 90mm guns specifically to engage Tigers and Panthers. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, entering service in early 1945, combined heavy armor with the 90mm gun to create a vehicle that could fight German heavy tanks on more equal terms. Every successful anti-tank round developed during the war followed the same basic principle: concentrate maximum energy on minimum area. The M82 armor-piercing shot for the 90mm gun weighed 24 pounds and left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. Its hardened steel penetrator, backed by explosive filler, could punch through nearly 6 inches of vertical armor plate at 500 yards. This represented the state-of-the-art in anti-tank munitions, the product of years of metallurgical research and ballistic testing. Against this established doctrine, the Flechette concept seemed not just unconventional but actively foolish. Each individual dart in the T15E1 weighed only 3 ounces, roughly 1/100th the mass of a conventional armor-piercing shot. Even at high velocity, such a light projectile would lose energy rapidly through air resistance. The dispersion pattern that Jensen considered an advantage looked like uncontrolled inaccuracy to traditional gunners. And the entire premise of attacking thin armor and vulnerable components rather than attempting frontal penetration contradicted the aggressive, direct-fire doctrine that American tank crews had learned to employ. Senior ordnance officers reviewing the T15E1 program questioned whether resources should be diverted to such an experimental system when proven weapons needed increased production. The Normandy campaign had consumed ammunition at rates that exceeded pre-invasion estimates. Tank destroyers and tanks in combat fired hundreds of rounds per engagement. Production capacity at arsenals and private contractors was fully committed to manufacturing conventional munitions. Introducing a radical new design would require retooling, testing, training, and doctrinal changes at a time when the military needed maximum output of proven weapons. Aberdeen Proving Ground's test schedule for the T15E1 began on January 15, 1945, under conditions of bureaucratic skepticism but technical rigor. The Ballistic Research Laboratory allocated 2 weeks for comprehensive trials, using captured German armor as targets, and employing the standard evaluation protocols developed for all experimental anti-tank munitions. Captain Jensen arrived from Frankfurt Arsenal with 300 prototype rounds and a team of engineers who had designed the projectile's sabot and flechette arrangement. The test firing used an M390mm anti-aircraft gun mounted on a fixed concrete platform. This weapon, adapted for the anti-tank role and designated the M1, served as the primary armament on M36 tank destroyers. Its performance characteristics were well documented. With standard M82 armor-piercing ammunition, it achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second and could penetrate 5.9 inches of vertical armor plate at 500 yards, 6.3 inches at 300 yards. Test protocol required firing at multiple ranges, 300, 500, and 700 yards, against different types of armor plate. The targets included sections of vertical armor, salvaged from destroyed German tanks, angled plates simulating the Panthers' glacis armor, and a complete Tiger I hull that had been shipped from Europe specifically for ordnance testing. Each firing would be photographed with high-speed cameras to document the flechette dispersion pattern and impact effects. The first test shot, fired at 300 yards against a vertical plate of 50mm armor, produced results that surprised even the program's advocates. The sabot separated cleanly 15 feet from the muzzle, visible in high-speed photography as 4 petals peeling away symmetrically. The flechette bundle remained coherent for approximately 100 yards, then began spreading as individual darts diverged along slightly different trajectories. At impact, the darts struck the target plate across a circular area measuring approximately 8 feet in diameter. 17 of the 20 flechettes hit the target plate. 3 missed entirely, diverging beyond the test range boundaries. Of those that hit, 11 penetrated completely through the 50mm armor, embedding themselves in the wooden backing boards positioned behind the plate. 4 penetrated partially, their tips visible protruding from the rear surface of the steel. 2 struck at such oblique angles that they failed to penetrate, instead gouging deep scratches across the plate's surface before ricocheting away. The penetrations were clean, almost surgical. Each flechette that achieved full penetration left a hole roughly half an inch in diameter, surrounded by minimal distortion of the metal. Unlike conventional armor-piercing rounds, which created stress fractures and spalling around the impact point, the flechettes punched through without shattering the surrounding armor. The ballistic cameras captured the darts traveling completely through the plate and continuing downrange with sufficient energy to penetrate the wooden backing. Officers observing the test exchanged glances. The skeptical laughter from the initial examination had given way to careful attention. Colonel Blackwell requested a second shot at the same range and target configuration. The results were nearly identical. 18 hits this time, 13 complete penetrations, dispersion pattern slightly larger, at 9 feet diameter. The test program continued with increasing range. At 500 yards, the dispersion pattern expanded to approximately 15 feet diameter. Penetration rates decreased as expected, with only 8 flechettes achieving full penetration of 50mm plate, but 12 scoring partial penetrations that would certainly have caused damage to internal components of an actual tank. At 700 yards, the pattern spread to 25 feet, and only 3 darts penetrated the test plate completely, though several others created significant gouges and dents. These results prompted immediate recalculation of the weapon's potential effectiveness. The wide dispersion at longer ranges, initially considered a fatal flaw, began to look like an advantage when considered against multiple targets or area coverage. A tank company in tactical formation, with vehicles spaced at regulation intervals, could potentially have multiple tanks damaged by a single flechette round fired into the formation's general area. The next phase tested the T15E1 against angled armor. Engineers positioned plates at 60 degrees from vertical, simulating the Panther tank's glacis armor configuration. This represented the most challenging target for conventional armor-piercing ammunition, as angled placement effectively doubled the thickness that rounds had to penetrate. The M82 armor-piercing shot, which could defeat 6 inches of vertical armor at close range, struggled against the Panther's 80mm glacis because the angle increased effective thickness to approximately 160mm. Flechettes, with their long, slender profile and needle-sharp points, performed unexpectedly well against angled targets. At 300 yards, firing against 80mm plate angled at 60 degrees, 9 flechettes achieved penetration, where a conventional round would have bounced off or shattered. The darts struck at various angles determined by their individual trajectories within the dispersion pattern. Some hit nearly perpendicular to the plate's surface and penetrated deeply. Others struck at oblique angles, but, rather than ricocheting, the sharp points bit into the metal and the dart's momentum drove it through. On January 20th, 1945, the test program reached its most significant trial. The complete Tiger I hull, positioned at 500 yards from the firing point, would be engaged with multiple T15E1 rounds to evaluate effects against an actual combat vehicle rather than isolated armor plates. The Tiger represented Germany's most formidable tank, mounting 80mm frontal armor on the hull and 100mm armor on the turret front. American tank crews feared and respected the Tiger, knowing that frontal engagements often ended badly for Allied armor. The test Tiger had been knocked out in France during the autumn of 1944. Artillery fire had destroyed its engine and running gear, but the hull and turret remained largely intact, making it ideal for ordnance testing. Technicians had positioned the vehicle at a slight angle to the firing line, presenting both frontal and side armor to the incoming fire, simulating a tactical situation where a gunner might encounter a German tank in a hull-down position or during a flanking maneuver. The first T15E1 round fired at the Tiger produced a dispersion pattern that covered the vehicle's entire frontal aspect. Camera crews positioned at oblique angles to the target photographed the impact sequence. Flechettes struck the hull front, the turret face, the tracks, the fenders, and the ground immediately around the vehicle. The sound of impacts came as a sharp, multiple staccato rather than the single heavy thud of a conventional armor-piercing hit. Examination of the Tiger revealed damage that exceeded predictions. 3 flechettes had penetrated the 20mm side armor above the tracks, punching clean holes that would have allowed them to strike internal components. 2 darts had penetrated the engine deck louvers, relatively thin armor designed to allow engine cooling while providing overhead protection. The openings in this armor, necessary for air circulation, gave the needle-pointed flechettes direct access to the engine compartment. 1 flechette had struck the gun barrel at an oblique angle, creating a deep gouge but not penetrating. Another had hit the turret ring, the junction between the rotating turret and the fixed hull, and had wedged itself into the gap. Engineers examining this impact noted that the dart had created enough distortion to potentially jam the turret's rotation mechanism. Several flechettes had struck the thick frontal armor and failed to penetrate, as expected, but even these impacts had created significant surface damage. The test continued with 5 more rounds fired at the Tiger from various angles. After each shot, engineers carefully documented the damage, measuring penetration depths, photographing entry holes, and assessing what effects these strikes would have on a functioning combat vehicle. The cumulative damage was impressive. By the 6th round, the Tiger's engine deck looked like it had been attacked with an enormous ice pick. Dozens of penetrations perforated the thin overhead armor. The side armor had multiple holes. The tracks had been struck repeatedly, with several flechettes wedging between track links or penetrating the thin armor behind the road wheels. Most significantly, 1 flechette from the 4th test round had struck the driver's vision port at a near-perfect angle and penetrated completely through the armored glass and housing. The dart had continued into the driver's compartment, embedding itself in the rear wall. Had the tank been crewed, this single hit would have killed or severely wounded the driver, effectively disabling the vehicle regardless of mechanical condition. Captain Jensen documented these results methodically, knowing that his report would face intense scrutiny. The question was not whether flechettes could damage tanks, the evidence now clearly demonstrated they could, but whether this damage justified the cost and complexity of fielding an unconventional weapon system. The Tiger test had shown that flechettes excelled at attacking vulnerable areas, penetrating thin armor, and creating multiple points of failure across a target. But critics could argue that conventional high-explosive rounds could achieve similar effects against soft targets, and that armor-piercing rounds remained superior for defeating heavy frontal armor. The T15E1's true value would depend on tactical context. Against dispersed targets, against tanks in hull-down positions exposing only turrets and upper hulls, against formations where area coverage mattered more than precision, the flechette round offered capabilities that conventional ammunition lacked. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The test program concluded with a classified demonstration for senior ordnance officers and representatives from the armoured force. On January 26, 1945, observers gathered at Aberdeen to witness a simulated combat scenario. Engineers had positioned 3 tank hulls, a Panzer IV, a Panther, and the tested Tiger, in a tactical formation simulating a German tank company defensive position. The vehicles were spaced at 75-yard intervals, arranged in a staggered line representing hull-down deployment behind terrain. 3 M36 tank destroyers, positioned at 800 yards from the targets, would engage the simulated enemy formation. 2 destroyers carried conventional M82 armor-piercing ammunition. The third carried exclusively T15E1 Flechette rounds. The demonstration would test whether flechettes offered practical advantages in realistic tactical employment, not just in controlled test firings. The scenario began with all 3 tank destroyers engaging simultaneously. The 2 vehicles with conventional ammunition aimed carefully at specific targets, using their gunners' telescopic sights to achieve precision. The destroyer with flechette ammunition aimed at the center of the enemy formation, relying on dispersion rather than precision to achieve effects. The first salvo illustrated the fundamental difference in employment doctrine. The conventional rounds struck with satisfying accuracy. One hit the Panzer IV's turret, penetrating and detonating inside with a flash of explosive filler. Another struck the Panther's upper hull, penetrating the side armor and causing visible damage. The Flechette round created a cloud of impacts across all three targets and the ground between them. Individual hits were difficult to observe from 800 yards, but the overall effect resembled a shotgun blast rather than a rifle shot. After 3 salvos, observers moved forward to examine damage. The Panzer IV and Panther showed catastrophic damage from the conventional rounds. Direct hits on critical areas had penetrated armor and detonated explosive fillers inside the vehicles. These were kill shots by any standard, the kind of precise, devastating impacts that proved American 90mm guns could defeat German armor when conditions allowed good shooting. The Tiger, which had been engaged primarily by Flechette rounds with only one conventional hit, showed different damage patterns. The single armor-piercing round had struck low on the hull, penetrating the side armor and creating obvious catastrophic damage. But the Flechette impacts, spread across 3 salvos, had created cumulative degradation that observers found remarkable. The engine deck was perforated with dozens of penetrations. Engineers estimated that the engine would have been destroyed by fragments and direct hits, even without the single armor-piercing strike. The turret ring showed impact, damage, and distortion. Multiple hits on the tracks and suspension had broken track links and damaged road wheels. The thin rear armor showed complete penetration in several places. The external fuel tanks, positioned on the Tiger's rear hull, had been holed repeatedly and would have leaked fuel across the engine deck. An armored force officer examining the Tiger made a comment that would appear in multiple after-action reports. Conventional rounds kill tanks with single shots if you hit the right spot. These Flechette rounds kill tanks by hitting every spot at once. Different problem, different solution. The demonstration had revealed something that pure ballistic testing could not fully illustrate. Against dispersed targets, Flechette rounds offered suppressive and area denial capabilities that conventional ammunition lacked. A tank destroyer commander facing multiple enemy vehicles could engage an entire formation with 1 or 2 Flechette rounds, potentially damaging all targets simultaneously, then switch to conventional ammunition to finish disabled vehicles. The tactical implications extended beyond simple target engagement. Flechette rounds fired at suspected enemy positions could suppress multiple vehicles simultaneously, forcing crews to button up and reducing their situational awareness. The wide dispersion pattern made the rounds effective against targets whose exact position was uncertain, a common situation in fluid combat where enemy tanks might be partially concealed behind terrain or vegetation. Colonel Blackwell, who had laughed at the Flechette concept 2 weeks earlier, now faced uncomfortable questions about his initial assessment. The test results were undeniable. The Tiger demonstration had been witnessed by multiple senior officers. The photographic evidence was comprehensive. The T15E1, despite violating conventional doctrine about armor penetration, achieved effects that conventional ammunition could not replicate under certain tactical conditions. The remaining question was whether these specialized capabilities justified production and fielding. American forces in Europe were advancing into Germany, facing increasingly desperate resistance as the Reich collapsed. Tank engagements remained common as German armored units attempted to slow the Allied advance. Would Flechette ammunition provide enough tactical advantage to warrant the disruption of introducing a new munition type? The answer would depend partly on events beyond Aberdeen Proving Ground's control. The test program had demonstrated technical feasibility and tactical potential, but the weapon's adoption would require support from field commanders, acceptance by tank destroyer crews, and allocation of scarce production resources. In January of 1945, with victory in Europe appearing increasingly certain but still requiring months of hard fighting, every decision about equipment and ammunition carried weight that extended far beyond technical specifications. The Ordnance Department faced a decision that required balancing technical promise against operational reality. By February of 1945, the T15E1 had completed successful testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, demonstrating capabilities that no one had anticipated when the program began. But testing success and combat adoption were separated by vast logistical and doctrinal obstacles that Captain Jensen and his advocates could not overcome through ballistic data alone. The European Theatre of Operations submitted formal requests for the Flechette ammunition in late February. Several tank destroyer battalion commanders, having reviewed the Aberdeen test reports, expressed interest in receiving limited quantities for field evaluation. The requests specified modest numbers, perhaps 500 rounds total, enough to equip several platoons for combat trials without requiring major changes to supply chains or ammunition handling procedures. Frankfurt Arsenal could produce these quantities. The manufacturing process, while unconventional, used existing machinery and materials. Each flechette required stamping, machining, heat treatment, and assembly. But these operations fell within the arsenal's capabilities. The sabot components were simple pressed metal. The propellant charge and cartridge case were identical to standard 90mm ammunition. Production engineers estimated they could manufacture 500 rounds per week once tooling was finalized and workers were trained in the assembly procedures. But by March of 1945, the strategic situation in Europe was evolving in ways that reduced the urgency of introducing new anti-tank munitions. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies were advancing through Poland toward Berlin. German armoured forces, while still dangerous, were experiencing severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. The massive tank battles that had characterized fighting in France and the Low Countries were giving way to infantry combat in towns and cities where anti-tank warfare played a diminishing role. The armoured force conducted its own evaluation of the T15E1, separate from the Ordnance Department's testing. Their assessment acknowledged the Flechette round's technical achievements, but questioned its practical utility given the specific tactical situations American tank units were encountering. Tank destroyers and tanks equipped with 90mm guns were already achieving high kill rates against German armour using conventional ammunition. The M82 armour-piercing round could defeat any German tank from frontal aspects at combat ranges. High explosive rounds were proving effective against softer targets and fortifications. Officers reviewing the program raised practical concerns about introducing a specialized munition that required different fire control procedures. Flechette rounds achieved their effects through dispersion and multiple hits, fundamentally different from the precision shooting doctrine that American gunners had trained to employ. Teaching crews to use flechettes effectively would require developing new tactics, creating training materials, and conducting live-fire exercises. In March of 1945, with the end of the European War potentially months away, this training burden seemed difficult to justify. The Pacific Theatre expressed minimal interest in the T-15E1. Japanese tanks, as combat experience from Saipan through Iwo Jima had demonstrated, were vulnerable to weapons far less powerful than 90mm guns. Marine tank units and Army tank battalions operating in the Pacific had learned that 50 caliber machine guns could penetrate Japanese armor at close range. The 75mm and 76mm guns on Sherman tanks were more than adequate for dealing with Japanese armor threats. 90mm guns were primarily deployed in anti-aircraft roles or in fixed coastal defense positions, not in mobile anti-tank employment. This lack of Pacific interest effectively eliminated half the potential market for Flechette ammunition. The Ordnance Department had hoped that demonstrating the T-15E1's effectiveness might create demand across multiple theatres, justifying production investment. But if only European forces wanted the ammunition, and European demand was lukewarm given the strategic situation, the case for full-scale production became increasingly difficult to make. In April of 1945, as American forces advanced deeper into Germany, the Ordnance Technical Committee reviewed the T-15E1 program status. Captain Jensen presented updated test data, photographs of the Tiger demonstration, and testimonials from officers who had witnessed the Aberdeen trials. His presentation was thorough and professional, acknowledging the ammunition's limitations while emphasizing its unique capabilities against dispersed armor and area targets. The committee's response was cautiously positive, but ultimately non-committal. They authorized limited production of 500 rounds for field trials in Europe, but declined to approve full-scale manufacturing or official type classification. The T15E1 would remain an experimental round, available in small quantities for specialized situations, but not adopted as standard ammunition for 90mm guns. The 500 T15E1 rounds produced at Frankfurt Arsenal arrived in Europe during the last weeks of April 1945. They were distributed to 3 tank destroyer battalions, operating with 1st Army and 3rd Army units pushing into central Germany. Each battalion received approximately 160 rounds, enough to load several vehicles completely, or to provide mixed ammunition loads, where some ready rounds were flechettes and others conventional armor-piercing or high-explosive. Combat records from this period are fragmentary, as the rapid pace of operations and the imminent German collapse created chaotic reporting conditions. However, several after-action reports and unit journals mention the flechette ammunition specifically, providing glimpses of how the rounds performed in actual combat rather than controlled testing. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, operating M36 tank destroyers in support of the 2nd Armoured Division, employed flechette rounds during an engagement near Magdeburg on April 23. The battalion encountered a German armoured formation consisting of several Panzer IV tanks and at least one Panther attempting to defend a river crossing. The German tanks were positioned in a tree line, partially concealed, making precision engagement difficult at the 800-yard range where contact was established. The battalion's after-action report notes that 2 M36 tank destroyers fired flechette rounds into the tree line, where German armour was suspected. The rounds were described as producing multiple impact sounds and visible strikes across a wide area. Following these initial flechette salvos, which apparently forced the German tanks to reposition or button up, conventional armor-piercing rounds were used to engage specific targets that revealed their positions. The engagement resulted in the destruction of 3 confirmed German tanks with no American losses. The report's author, a battalion operations officer, commented that the flechette rounds appeared useful for suppressive fire against suspected enemy positions, forcing enemy tanks to close hatches and reducing their ability to observe and engage effectively. However, he noted that conventional ammunition remained necessary for achieving actual kills, as the flechette impacts, while numerous, did not appear to cause immediate catastrophic damage in the way that armor-piercing rounds did when they penetrated and detonated inside target vehicles. Another employment report came from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which used flechette ammunition during urban fighting in a German town whose name was redacted in the declassified document. The battalion encountered German armour and anti-tank guns positioned in buildings and rubble, creating a complex urban battlefield where targets were difficult to locate precisely. Flechette rounds were fired at buildings suspected of containing enemy vehicles, with the intention of using the wide dispersion pattern to strike multiple potential hiding positions simultaneously. The results were described as mixed but interesting. The flechette rounds created extensive damage to building facades and apparently achieved some penetrations into interior spaces where vehicles might have been concealed. However, the thick stone and masonry construction of German buildings degraded the flechette's effectiveness, as the darts lost energy penetrating walls before reaching any vehicles inside. The battalion commander concluded that flechettes might be useful in urban warfare against lighter structures, but that high-explosive rounds were more effective against buildings and fortifications in typical European town fighting. The most detailed combat report came from the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which engaged a German tank formation in open terrain near Leipzig on April 18th. This engagement most closely resembled the tactical scenario that the Aberdeen demonstration had simulated, with multiple enemy tanks in a dispersed formation at medium range. The battalion's M36 tank destroyers fired a mix of flechette and conventional rounds at the German formation, which consisted of approximately 6 tanks identified as Panzer IVs and Panthers. The engagement report describes flechette rounds, creating visible impact patterns across the enemy formation, with dust and sparks indicating multiple hits on several vehicles. German tanks that were struck by flechette rounds appeared to slow or stop, suggesting damage to external components or crew suppression effects. However, these vehicles were not immediately destroyed, requiring follow-up engagements with armor-piercing rounds to achieve confirmed kills. The battalion commander's assessment praised the Flechette ammunition's suppressive effect, but questioned whether it provided sufficient advantage over simply firing more conventional rounds. His concern was practical rather than technical. Tank destroyers carried limited ammunition, typically 47 rounds in the M36. If Flechette rounds required follow-up with conventional ammunition to achieve kills, they effectively consumed 2 rounds per target rather than 1, reducing the vehicle's sustained combat capability. These mixed field reports reflected the fundamental tension in the T15E1 program. The Flechette ammunition performed as designed, creating wide dispersion patterns and achieving multiple hits across target areas. But combat effectiveness depended on tactical context in ways that testing could not fully predict. Against dispersed formations in open terrain, Flechettes offered real advantages. In close terrain, urban environments, or situations requiring immediate kills rather than suppression, conventional ammunition remained superior. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, approximately 300 of the 500 T15E1 rounds produced for field trials remained unfired. The ammunition was consolidated at supply depots and eventually returned to the United States for storage and evaluation. The Ordnance Department conducted post-war analysis of the program, examining combat reports, interviewing tank destroyer crews who had used the ammunition, and assessing whether Flechette technology warranted continued development. The final report, completed in August of 1945, concluded that the T15E1 had demonstrated technical feasibility and tactical utility in specific situations, but did not justify adoption as standard ammunition. The report noted that conventional 90mm ammunition had proven adequate for all anti-tank missions encountered in combat, and that specialized Flechette rounds addressed problems that, while real, were not significant enough to warrant the complications of fielding a second ammunition type with different ballistic characteristics and employment doctrine. Captain Jensen, who had advocated for the program throughout its development and testing, accepted this conclusion with professional disappointment but intellectual honesty. In his final technical report on the project, he acknowledged that the T15E1 had succeeded as an engineering achievement while failing to achieve practical adoption. The Flechette concept worked as predicted. The rounds achieved their intended effects. But in the broader context of industrial warfare, where production capacity, logistical simplicity, and doctrinal coherence mattered as much as technical performance, the unconventional ammunition could not compete with proven conventional designs. The story of the T15E1 faded into the classified archives of the Ordnance Department. The remaining ammunition was eventually expended in post-war testing or demilitarized. The test data, photographs, and reports were filed away, accessible to researchers but forgotten by the broader military community. For decades, the Flechette anti-tank round existed only as a footnote in technical histories of American ammunition development, an interesting experiment that led nowhere. Yet the fundamental concepts behind the T15E1 did not disappear entirely. The idea that multiple, small projectiles could achieve effects different from single large projectiles continued to intrigue weapons designers. During the Vietnam War, the United States developed Flechette rounds for artillery and aircraft weapons, using the same basic principle of dispersion and multiple impacts that the T15E1 had demonstrated. These weapons saw extensive combat use, proving effective in roles where area coverage mattered more than precision. In the 1980s and 1990s, as military technology advanced, Flechette concepts reappeared in various forms. Tank gun ammunition designers experimented with kinetic energy penetrators that resembled scaled-up Flechettes, long, thin projectiles designed to achieve armor penetration through velocity and sectional density. While these modern penetrators did not disperse like the T15E1's darts, they shared the fundamental principle that long, thin projectiles could achieve penetration through different mechanisms than conventional armor-piercing shot. The T-15E1's legacy is less about the specific weapon system and more about the broader questions it raised regarding innovation in military technology. The program demonstrated that unconventional approaches to familiar problems could achieve real technical success, validated through rigorous testing and limited combat employment. But technical success alone could not guarantee adoption in a military system that prioritized logistics, training, standardization, and proven reliability. Officers who had laughed at the Flechette concept during initial demonstrations had not been wrong to express skepticism. Military conservatism regarding weapons adoption serves important purposes, preventing the fielding of unreliable or impractical systems that might fail in combat. But those same officers, confronted with test results that contradicted their expectations, had demonstrated the intellectual flexibility to reassess their positions based on evidence. The Ordnance Department's willingness to fund testing despite widespread skepticism reflected institutional openness to innovation, even when it challenged conventional wisdom. The gap between the T-15E1's test performance and its limited combat adoption illustrates a fundamental reality of military procurement. Weapons must succeed not only technically but also operationally, logistically, and doctrinally. A round that could shred Tiger tank engine decks at Aberdeen Proving Ground was less useful in May of 1945 Germany than a conventional round that crews already knew how to employ effectively. Innovation must align with operational needs, not just demonstrate technical possibility. For the engineers and officers who worked on the T-15E1 program, the experience offered lessons that would inform subsequent weapons development projects. Captain Jensen went on to a distinguished career in ordnance research, eventually retiring as a colonel after contributing to several successful ammunition programs. In his memoirs, written decades after the war, he reflected on the Flechette project as a valuable learning experience, despite its failure to achieve adoption. He had learned that successful innovation required not just solving technical problems, but also addressing the human, organizational, and practical challenges of integrating new capabilities into existing military systems. The T-15E1 represents a particular kind of historical artifact, a weapon that succeeded technically but failed institutionally, demonstrating capability without achieving impact. These weapons populate military history, often more interesting than the successful systems that achieved widespread adoption precisely because they reveal the complex factors that determine whether innovation translates into operational reality. Technical performance matters, but so do timing, logistics, training, doctrine, and the specific tactical problems that military forces actually face rather than those they might theoretically encounter. When those officers gathered at Aberdeen Proving Ground on that January morning in 1945, examining a shell filled with steel darts and laughing at its apparent absurdity, they could not have predicted how the next few weeks would unfold. The tests would demonstrate capabilities that challenged their assumptions. Combat employment would reveal both possibilities and limitations. And ultimately, the program would achieve its technical objectives, while failing to change how American tank destroyers fought. The story began with mockery directed at a ridiculous concept. It ended with acknowledgement that the concept worked, coupled with the practical judgment that working was not enough. Between those two moments lay weeks of rigorous testing, careful analysis, limited combat employment, and honest assessment by officers willing to let evidence guide their conclusions even when it contradicted their initial assumptions. That intellectual honesty, more than any specific weapon system, represents what made American military procurement effective during World War II, a willingness to test unconventional ideas while maintaining standards that prevented poor systems from reaching combat troops. The T-15E1 Flechette round shredded test targets at Aberdeen. It damaged German tanks in the war's final weeks, but it never became the weapon that changed anti-tank warfare, never achieved the transformative impact that its test performance seemed to promise. Instead, it became something perhaps more valuable, a case study in how innovation succeeds and fails, how technical achievement relates to operational adoption, and how military organizations balance the proven against the promising when both compete for scarce resources in wartime. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.